Kethra dragged herself across the cold stone floor of the mining pit, leaving a trail of dark blood behind her. And she knew that she was going to die soon, perhaps within 3 cycles. Maybe less if the overseers decided to speed things along. Her left leg was gone below the knee, crushed 2 cycles ago when a support beam collapsed in Tunnel 7. And the Valdrix did not waste medical resources on slaves who could not work. So they had simply cauterized the wound with a plasma torch and left her to figure out the rest on her own. She had figured it out. And the answer was death. The mining pit stretched endlessly in every direction. A massive crater carved into the purple rock of this nameless moon. And hundreds of her fellow Scythini worked under the harsh glow of plasma lamps that never dimmed. Their pale exoskeletons covered in mineral dust and cracks from years of brutal labor. None of them looked at her as she crawled past. And she understood why, because looking meant acknowledging. And acknowledging meant caring, and caring meant hope. And hope was something the Valdrix had beaten out of everyone here. A long time ago, Kethra found a small alcove beneath a rocky outcropping near the waste disposal area, a place where the overseers rarely bothered to check. And she wedged herself into the shadows to wait for the end that she knew was coming. From her hiding spot, she could see the landing platform where the transport ships arrived every quarter cycle, bringing new slaves from whatever worlds the Valdrix had recently conquered. And she watched with dull eyes as another ship descended through the brown clouds above. Cargo bay opened with a hiss of pressurized air, and bodies spilled out onto the gravel, stumbling and falling as the guards shoved them forward with electric prods. And Kethra recognized some of the species from her years in the pit. They were Rilthi, tall and muscular, with 4 arms that made them valuable for heavy lifting. And there were Quellan, small beings whose skin normally glowed with soft bioluminescence, but whose light had already begun to fade in the harsh environment of the mines. And there was something else, a creature she had never seen before in all her cycles of captivity. It walked on 2 legs like a Scythini, but had no exoskeleton, just soft pink skin that looked terribly vulnerable. And it had strange forward-facing eyes that swept across the mining pit with an expression she could not read, something that was not fear or despair, but looked almost like calculation. The guards pushed the creature forward, and it stumbled but did not fall, catching itself with a strange grace. And one of the other new slaves whispered a word that Kethra had heard only in rumors and stories: human. Human was male, according to what she could observe. And he was smaller than most of the other species in the pit. And he should have been. Broken within hours, given how fragile his kind appeared to be. But on the first night, something strange happened. Ra was drifting in and out of consciousness when she heard a commotion near the new slave quarters, and she dragged herself to a position where she could see what was happening. And what she saw made no sense to her at all. The human was kneeling beside a Quellan child, whose arm had been broken during the transport, and he was doing something with strips of fabric torn from his own clothing and pieces of scrap metal he had somehow gathered. And he was talking in a low, calm voice, even though the child could not understand his language. An overseer noticed and came over with his shock, staff raised. And the human looked up at the towering Valdrix with those strange forward-facing eyes, and he did not stop what he was doing. Not even when the first blow landed across his back. He finished setting the bone and wrapping it, and only then did he stand to face his punishment. And the overseer beat him until he could not stand, but the human never cried out. And when it was over, he lay in the dust breathing hard, but still alive. The next night he did it again for a different slave, an elderly Rilthi whose hand had been crushed in the machinery, and he was beaten again. And still he did not stop. Kethra watched this happen 5 more times over the following cycles. And each time she expected the human to learn his lesson and stop his foolish behavior. And each time he refused to stop, treating wounds and setting bones and cleaning infections with whatever materials he could scavenge. The other slaves began to whisper about him. and someone learned that his people called him Graves, and that he had been a medic on some kind of medical ship before the Valdrix captured him, and that his entire purpose in life had been to heal the wounded and sick. This information meant nothing to most of the slaves because they had learned long ago that healing was pointless in a place like this, that the Valdrix would simply work you until you broke and then replace you with someone new, and that caring for the broken only delayed the inevitable. But Kethra found herself watching the human with growing curiosity. This soft, fragile creature who kept trying to fix things that everyone else had given up on. And she wondered what it must be like to come from a species that refused to accept that some things could not be saved. On the 7th cycle after his arrival, the human made his way to the waste disposal area during the rest period, moving carefully to avoid the attention of the guards. And he found the alcove where Kethra had been hiding and waiting to die. He looked at her ruined leg and then at her face, and his expression was neither pity nor disgust, but something else entirely, something that looked almost like professional interest. And he said 3 words in broken common trade that she would remember for the rest of her life. Fix this. Kethra told him he was insane, that helping her would mean death for both of them, that the Valdrix monitored everything and would never allow a crippled slave to return to usefulness. But the human only made a strange expression with his mouth, pulling the corners upward in what she would later learn was called a smile. And in that moment she realized something that changed everything she thought she knew about the universe and the beings that lived in it. The human was not smiling because he thought he would succeed, and he was not smiling because he was too stupid to understand the danger, and he was not smiling because he had given up and accepted death. He was smiling because he had already decided that helping her was worth dying for, and nothing she could say would change his mind. And this was simply what humans did when they found something broken. They fixed it, or they died trying, and either way they never stopped. Graves returned to Kethra's hiding place every rest cycle for the next 30 rotations, and each time he brought something new: a scrap of metal from the forge, a piece of wire stolen from the machinery, a small vial of fluid harvested from sources she did not want to think about. He never explained what he was doing, and when she asked, he simply shook his head and continued working on whatever strange project occupied his hands, his fingers moving with a precision that seemed impossible for such a soft and clumsy-looking species. During this time, Kethra learned more about humans than she had ever expected. To learn about anything, she learned that Graves had been captured when the Valdrix raided a colonial medical vessel traveling through neutral space, and that his crew had been killed or scattered, and that he alone had been taken as a slave because the Valdrix thought a doctor might be useful for keeping their workforce alive a little longer. She learned that humans came from a small blue world on the far side of the galaxy, a planet they called Earth, and that they had spread across the stars, not through conquest like the Valdrix, but through something they called curiosity, a need to see what was beyond the next horizon. She learned that humans had a strange relationship with broken things, that instead of discarding what was damaged, they felt compelled to repair it, and that this compulsion extended to everything from machines to buildings to living beings. And she learned that Graves was not simply treating her wound or trying to make her comfortable before she died, but was instead building something that she could not understand, something that required materials from all over the mining complex. He traded his medical skills for access and resources, and Kethra watched with amazement as he convinced first the Quellan elders and then even some of the Rilthian forces to help him gather what he needed. Quellan gave him samples of their molted skin, which contained regenerative cells that could bond with almost any biological tissue, and the Rilthi provided muscle fibers from their own shed growth plates, and even some of the Scythini contributed fragments of their Discarded kiting graves collected all of these things and disappeared into a hidden space behind the thermal vents where the heat made surveillance impossible. And there he worked during every spare moment. And Kethra had no idea what he was creating until the night he finally showed her. She had been sleeping in her alcove when he appeared beside her, his face covered in sweat and his eyes bright with something that looked like triumph. And in his hands he held the strangest object she had ever seen. It was shaped like a leg, her leg, with joints in the right places and a foot that curved the way a Scythini foot should curve. But it was not made of metal like the dead mechanical limbs the Valdrics gave their wounded soldiers. It was alive. The frame was constructed from refined ore that glittered like starlight. But wrapped around that frame were layers of synthetic muscle that pulsed with a gentle rhythm. And woven through the muscle were neural fibers that glowed faintly blue in the darkness. And coating the entire surface was a thin layer of something that looked almost like skin your people. The Quellan the Rilthi Grave said in his improving common trade, "You all have pieces that alone mean nothing, but together they become something new." And he held up his creation with obvious pride. "Something I call living steel." Kethra stared at the prosthetic and felt fear rising in her chest because this was not possible. This was not something that should exist. This was something that would get them both killed if the Valdrics ever discovered it. But Graves was already explaining how it worked, how the Quellan cells would allow the prosthetic to bond with her living tissue, how the Rilthi muscle fibers would provide strength beyond what her original leg had possessed, how the neural network would connect directly to her nervous system so that she could control it with thought alone. The surgery took 6 hours. Graves worked by the dim light of a stolen plasma torch, his hands steady despite the danger. And Kethra bit through her own lip to keep from screaming as he cut away dead tissue and connected living steel to living flesh. There was pain beyond anything she had ever experienced. And there were moments when she was certain she would die. And there were times when she wished she would die just to make it stop. But Graves never stopped, and he never hesitated. And whenever she looked up at him through her haze of agony, she saw that same expression on his face. That same smile that said he had already accepted whatever consequences might come and was focused only on the work in front of him. When it was over, she lay in the darkness trembling and weak. And she looked down at the thing that was now attached to her body. This fusion of biology and technology that hummed with warmth and power. Graves helped her to her feet. And she stood for the first time in over 40 cycles, and the leg moved when she told it to move. And it felt not like a machine bolted to her body, but like a part of her that had always been there. She took a step, and then another, and then she was walking across the alcove on 2 legs, one of flesh and one of living steel, and tears streamed down her face because she had forgotten what it felt like to be whole. Graves watched her with that strange human smile. And when she turned to look at him, she finally understood what he had really given her. Not just a leg, and not just mobility, and not just a chance to survive a little longer in the mines. He had given her something the Valdrics had stolen from her people generations ago. Something she had thought was gone forever. Something that burned in her chest like a fire that could not be extinguished. He had given her hope, and as she stood there on her new leg in the hidden darkness behind the thermal vents, Kethra made a decision that would change the fate of worlds. She would learn everything this human could teach her, and then she would teach others. And together, they would show the Valdrics what happened when broken things refused to stay broken. The human had fixed her body, but more importantly, he had fixed something inside her that she had not even realized was damaged, and now she was going to help him fix everything else. Word spread through the mining complex like fire through dry grass, carried in whispers on recycled air, and passed from worker to worker in the brief moments between shifts when the overseers were not watching. The human medic could make the broken whole again. And not just whole, but better than before, Graves understood that they had to be careful. That moving too fast would attract attention and bring destruction down upon everyone who had helped him. So he chose his patients with great care during those first few months. He selected slaves whose improvements could be hidden, workers whose jobs would not reveal their enhanced capabilities, beings who knew how to keep secrets and understood what was at stake. A Rilfi named Vorduk received a rebuilt arm after his original was crushed in a mining accident, and the new limb was stronger than both his remaining arms combined. But he operated drilling equipment where no one would notice the difference in his strength. Quell, an elder named Shimmering, Dawn had her bioluminescence restored using a combination of her own regenerative cells and synthetic compounds, Graves created from mining chemicals. But she attributed the return of her glow to improved nutrition, and the overseers believed here a Sithini tunnel worker named Kethvan received a rebuilt spine that allowed him to stand straight for the first time in decades. But he continued to walk with a false limp so that no one would suspect what had been done to him. Kethra became the center of the network, her prosthetic leg containing a hidden compartment that Graves had designed specifically for smuggling components between different sections of the mine. And she moved through the complex like a ghost, carrying pieces of living steel to those who needed them. But Graves understood that fixing bodies was only part of what needed to be done, because he would not live forever, and he could not be everywhere at once. And so he began to teach. The classes were held in the spaces behind the thermal vents where surveillance was impossible. And slaves from a dozen different species gathered in the darkness to learn what the human had to offer. He taught them basic anatomy, drawing diagrams in mineral dust that showed how different species were constructed and where their weaknesses and strengths could be found. He taught them wound treatment, showing them how to clean infections and close cuts and set broken bones using nothing but the materials available in the mines. And most importantly, he taught them the principles of fusion, the techniques he had developed for combining biological materials from different species into something greater than any single source could produce. The Valdrics have controlled you for so long because they keep you separate, Graves explained to his growing number of students. And his common trade had become fluid and confident through constant practice. They conquer species one at a time, and they never let the conquered share knowledge or resources with each other. Held up a sample of living steel, the metallic frame wrapped in layers of tissue from 4 different species, and the faint blue glow of the neural network cast strange shadows on the walls of the hidden classroom. But you are not separate anymore, he continued, and his voice carried a weight that made everyone lean forward to listen. You are all here together, and each of you has something the others need. And when you combine what you have, you become something the Valdrics have never faced before. Kethra watched these sessions with growing pride, because she had been his first student, and now she was helping to train others. And the network they were building spread through the mining complex like the roots of a great tree growing beneath the surface. Other slaves began to contribute in whatever ways they could. A stolen circuit board here, a harvested cell sample there, a piece of equipment that went missing from a supply depot and reappeared in the hidden workshops behind the thermal vents. Overseers noticed that productivity was improving, that fewer slaves were dying from injuries and infections, that the workforce seemed healthier and more capable than it had been in years. But they attributed this to fear and better management, and they never suspected the truth. Every night Graves held another class, and every night more students learned his techniques. And every night the army of the broken grew stronger, while their masters remained blind to what was happening beneath their feet. Kethra asked him once why he was doing this, why he had risked everything to help beings he had never met from species he had never encountered. And Graves was quiet for a long moment before he answered, "On my world, we have a concept called the Oath," he said, and his eyes were distant, as if he was seeing something far away. And when you become a doctor, you swear to help anyone who needs help regardless of who they are or where they come from or what they have done. He looked at her with those strange forward-facing eyes that she had learned to read over the months they had worked together. I swore that oath before I knew your people existed, he continued. But it does not matter because the oath is not about species or borders or politics. And it is about seeing suffering and refusing to walk away. And it is about believing that every broken thing deserves a chance to be whole. Again, Catherine nodded slowly because she understood now. She understood why humans were different from every other species she had encountered. She understood why this soft, fragile creature had managed to do what no one else had done in generations of. Valdric's rule humans did not see the galaxy the way other species did not divide beings into worthy and unworthy, did not accept that some things were simply meant to be broken forever. They looked at the universe and saw not what was but what could be. And then they set about making it happen regardless of the cost. The network continued to grow, spreading beyond Pit 17 into other sections of the mining complex, and then beyond the complex itself into other installations on the moon, and then beyond the moon to other worlds where Valdric's slaves labored in darkness and despair, and everywhere the message spread, carried by smuggled communications and whispered conversations and the testimony of those who had been healed. The same promise that Graves had made to Kethra on the day they first met. I fixed this. 3 words that had become a revolution. The day everything changed began like any other day in Pit 17, with the harsh sound of the work sirens and the shuffle of exhausted bodies moving toward the tunnels. And Kethra was organizing a supply transfer in the lower levels when she heard the announcement Overseer Vrixel had selected 20 slaves for the crushers. This was not unusual, because the Valdrics performed callings every few months as a reminder to the workforce that they were replaceable, that their lives meant nothing, that resistance was pointless because there would always be more slaves to take their place. But this time was different because among the 20 names called was Calvin, a young Quellan who had been one of Graves' best students, a gentle soul who had spent the last several months teaching medical techniques to the children. In the lower tunnels, Kethra felt something cold settle in her stomach as she made her way to the central platform where the callings always took place, and she saw the crowd of slaves who had gathered to watch, their faces empty of expression because showing emotion at a calling was dangerous. The 20 condemned slaves stood in a line near the edge of the platform, and behind them the massive ore crushers rumbled and groaned, ready to receive their bodies and grind them into nothing. Overseer Vrixel stood before them, tall and terrible in his ceremonial armor, and his voice boomed across the pit as he delivered the standard speech about obedience and productivity and the price of failure. Kethra found Graves in the crowd, and their eyes met, and she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before, something that went beyond determination or defiance, something that looked like a decision being made in real time. She pushed through the crowd toward him, whispering urgently that this was not the time, that they were not ready, that acting now would destroy everything they had built. Graves shook his head slowly and said 4 words that changed everything. "We are ready now," and then he stepped forward out of the crowd. And Kethra felt her heart stop because she knew what he was about to do. And she knew that once it started, there would be no going back. But before Graves could reach the platform, Kethra found herself moving, found her living steel leg carrying her forward faster than she had ever moved, found herself standing between the condemned slaves and the overseer with her arms spread wide. She did not know where the courage came from, did not know why she had chosen this moment to throw away everything they had worked for. But the words came out of her mouth before she could stop them. No, the single word echoed across the pit, and for a moment everything was silent. And Overseer Vrixel stared at her with an expression of complete disbelief. because no slave had ever defied a culling order in the entire history of this installation. Then the overseer laughed, a harsh sound like metal scraping against stone, and he raised his hand to signal the guards. Skethra braced herself for the shock staffs and the beating that would follow. But instead she heard footsteps behind her, and she turned to see Vortic the Rilthi stepping out of the crowd to stand beside her, his rebuilt arm flexing with power that his masters had never suspected. Then another figure joined them, and another, and within moments there were 50 slaves standing between the condemned and the crushers, their faces no longer empty, but burning with something that the Valdrix had tried to extinguish. Generations ago, Overseer Vrixel stopped laughing, and his expression shifted from amusement to confusion to something that looked almost like fear. And he screamed at his guards to restore order. The guards opened fire. The first volley of plasma bolts struck Kethra directly in the chest, and she felt the impact like a hammer blow, felt the heat searing through her clothes and into her body. And she waited for the darkness to take her, but the darkness did not come. She looked down on herself and saw that her chest was smoking, but she was still standing, still breathing, still alive. And she understood in that moment what Graves had really been building all these months. The latest generation of his prosthetics were not just limbs or organs, but distributed networks throughout the body. Lattice of living steel that reinforced bone and muscle and skin, that could absorb kinetic energy and heat and redistribute it across a larger surface area. Slaves he had treated over the past year were not just healed. They were armored in ways their masters had never imagined. The guards fired again, and the enhanced slaves absorbed the blasts and kept moving forward. And for the first time in the history of Pit 17, the Valdrix felt what their slaves had felt for generations: fear. Revolt lasted 11 minutes from start to finish. Kethra led the charge against the guards, her living steel leg delivering kicks that shattered armor and broke bones. And around her the other enhanced slaves fought with strength and coordination that should have been impossible for a group of untrained laborers. Vortak used his rebuilt arm to tear a shock staff from a guard's hands and turn it against its owner. And shimmering dawn's restored bioluminescence flared so bright that it blinded 3 overseers long enough for other slaves to overwhelm them. Graves did not fight, because he had never been a warrior, but he moved through the chaos, treating the wounded and directing the unenhanced slaves to safety. And his calm voice cut through the screaming and the weapons fire like a beacon. When it was over, every Valdrix in the complex was either dead or restrained. And the slaves of Pit 17 stood in stunned silence as they realized what they had done, what they had become, what was now possible. Graves climbed onto the central platform and looked out at the sea of faces staring up at him. Beings from a dozen different species who had just won their first victory against an enemy that had seemed invincible. He walked to the communications array that the Valdrix used to coordinate with other installations, and he activated the broadcast function, and his voice carried across every mining frequency on the moon and beyond. "If you want to be whole, come to Pit 17, he said, and his words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened. "And if you want to fight, we will teach you how." Then he stepped back from the console and turned to face Kethra. And he smiled, that strange human smile that she had learned to love over the months they had worked together. "Now we are ready," he said, and the revolution had begun. 3 months after the uprising at Pit 17, the Valdrix hegemony finally decided to take the rebellion seriously, and they sent a battle fleet of 200 warships to crush what they assumed was a small group of escaped slaves hiding in the mining tunnels. They were wrong about almost everything. Fleet dropped out of hyperspace, above the nameless moon, expecting to find chaos and desperation, expecting to make quick work of primitives armed with stolen weapons and mining equipment, expecting to restore order within a matter of hours. Instead, they found an army ships rose from the surface to meet them. Vessels that had been constructed in secret using materials from 47 mining installations across 6 different planets. Crewed by beings who had spent the last 3 months learning to work together in ways the galaxy had never seen. They called themselves the Amalgam. And they were something new in the universe. Each soldier and their ranks was a fusion of species, not through breeding or genetic manipulation, but through choice and technology and the techniques that one human medic had developed in the darkness of a slave. Pitsithin Kaiden reinforced Rilthi muscle, providing armor that could withstand plasma fire while maintaining the flexibility needed for close combat. And Qualan neural networks connected everything together, allowing instant communication and coordination across entire battlefields. Human tactical thinking directed the whole, because Graves had not been the only human working in Valdric space. And as word of the rebellion spread, other survivors of captured ships had made their way to join the cause, bringing with them knowledge of warfare and strategy that complemented the raw power of the enhanced soldiers. The battle above the nameless moon lasted 6 hours, and when it was over half, the Valdric's fleet had been destroyed and the other half was in full retreat. And the Amalgam had suffered losses, but they had won their first major engagement against the Hegemony Kethra, commanded the ground defense during the battle, leading a force of 3,000 enhanced soldiers against Valdric's troops that had landed in an attempt to retake the mining installations. And her living steel leg carried her across the battlefield faster than any enemy could track. She had changed in the months since the uprising, grown into a leader that she never would have imagined she could become. But she still remembered what it felt like to lie in the darkness waiting to die. And that memory gave her strength when the fighting was hardest. The war that followed lasted 8 years. It spread across the Valdric's mining territories and then beyond, drawing in other species who had suffered under hegemony rule. And everywhere the Amalgam went, they brought the same message that Graves had broadcast from Pit 17. We will make you whole. And we will teach you to fight. And together, we will build something new. The Valdric's commanders demanded to negotiate, certain that such a coordinated rebellion must be led by some military genius who would eventually be willing to make a deal. And they requested a meeting with the human leaders, who they assumed were directing everything from behind the scenes. Graves walked to the negotiating table alone, still wearing the tattered remains of the medical uniform he had been captured in all those years ago. And he faced the Valdric's High Commander with the same calm expression he had worn when treating wounds in the slave pits. I am not a soldier, he told the commander, and his voice carried no anger or hatred, only a kind of tired patience. I am a doctor, and I heal things. He gestured to the army assembled behind him. Beings from 30 different species, standing shoulder to shoulder, their bodies enhanced with living steel, their faces determined and unafraid. And you gave me a lot of patience. He continued. The Valdric surrendered 3 months later, their hegemony fractured beyond repair, their conquered territories falling away one by one as the Amalgam spread across what had once been an empire built on slavery. In the aftermath, there were debates about what the Amalgam should become, whether it should form a government or dissolve into its component species or transform into something else entirely. But in the end, they chose a path that no one had expected. They became a people, not a species bound by biology, not an alliance bound by treaties, but a people bound by choice and shared experience and the belief that broken things deserved to be made whole. They built a capital on the nameless moon where it had all started, transforming the old mining pits into gardens and schools and hospitals. And in the center of the new city, they erected a statue that told the story of how everything had begun. The statue showed a Scythini woman standing on one leg of flesh and one of living steel, reaching down to help a fallen figure rise, and her face was fierce and gentle at the same time. The face of someone who had been broken and remade into something stronger. The plaque beneath the statue bore a human word that had no direct translation in any galactic language. A word that Graves had taught them during those first classes in the hidden spaces behind the thermal venstriage. The plaque read, "The practice of determining priority based not on who is most likely to survive, but on who most needs." Saving Graves retired from warfare but never stopped teaching, and his medical school spread across 100 worlds, training doctors from every species in the techniques of living steel and fusion healing. And his students carried his philosophy to the farthest reaches of known space, the belief that every broken thing contained the seeds of something stronger, the understanding that healing was not just about restoring what had been lost, but about discovering what could be gained, the conviction that no one was beyond saving. No matter how damaged or hopeless they might seem, Kethra lived for another 200 cycles, long enough to see the amalgam grow from a rebellion into a civilization, long enough to see children born who had never known slavery, long enough to see Graves' legacy transform the galaxy in ways neither of them could have imagined when she finally died, peacefully in her sleep in a hospital that bore Graves' name. They found a small piece of metal clutched in her hand, a fragment of the original living steel that the human mech had used to build her first prosthetic leg, and carved into that fragment, worn smooth by years of handling, were 3 words that had started a revolution. "I fixed this." The words of a human who had looked at a broken galaxy and refused to accept that it had to stay broken, the words that had changed everything.